All right, so we're now into week 3 of the semester. This week we'll pick up with the economic and political context of social welfare policy. And so in this lecture, in this two-part lecture, I'm going to emphasize mostly about the economic context. There's a separate reading in your article by Donald Lindhorst in which he discusses the federalist structure, which refers to the nature of the relationship between federal and state governments and what that means for social workers and for advocacy efforts. And so I'll let you go ahead and read that article to think more deeply about the political context in which social welfare policy occurs. But this lecture will be focused primarily on the economic context. And so in this two-part lecture, these are the topics that I want to make sure that we cover. So first, we'll offer some basic terminology. We'll think about the concepts, the terminology that economists often use in this first section. And then there's, we're going to emphasize here fiscal policy. And what we mean by fiscal policy, we're referring to the government's taxing and spending authority and their actions pertaining to fiscal policy. And then finally, we'll look at monetary policy, just a brief note on monetary policy in this first section. To integrate all this material, we'll think about two sort of philosophical traditions or two different approaches on how the government best stimulates or stabilizes the economy. And that's thinking about Keynesian philosophy or Keynesian approaches versus supply-side approaches. That'll wrap up this first section. And then in the second part of this lecture, we'll cover the tax treatment of low-income populations to apply it to social welfare policy. And so to do that, we'll look at the largest anti-poverty measure that's conducted by the federal government today, and that's the Earned Income Tax Credit. And so we're going to spend the entire second half of this lecture just talking about how that program operates. Okay? So first, just in terms of basic terminology that I want to cover. So economics, you may have already studied some economics or taken an economics course in another class. So if you took microeconomics before, you probably studied something about consumer behavior or what might have been termed utility maximization. You might have studied the production theory or on the production side, what firms do to maximize their profits. In other words, you may have spent another third of the semester talking about market failures or different scenarios in which private markets fail and what government's role might be under those scenarios. And so that's all material that might be covered in microeconomics courses. And then, of course, there's macroeconomics, the study of the economy as a whole. And so this is sort of the scope of economics and what your textbook author refers to the study as the study of social systems. So we operate under an assumption of scarcity today, right? So we consider resources that we have in our society today to be scarce and not as abundant as they used to be. And so assuming this notion of scarcity, how do we allocate those resources is the province or is the basic scope of the study of economics, right? How do we allocate those scarce resources? How do we organize our society to allocate those resources is what we're referring to in this section. So there are two primary concerns that often economists and policy analysts will be concerned with, and that's this notion of efficiency. We've alluded to one type of efficiency before, and that's by defining Pareto efficiency in a previous lecture. And then there's, of course, the issue of equity. So Dolgoff, in your reading, terms it equality. Equality and equity is not always the same thing. So you can have an equal allocation or an equal distribution of resources, and it may or may not be equitable, right, according to a policy analyst. But just to throw these terms out there, I just want to introduce you to these terms, efficiency and equity. These are the goals that we're seeking to achieve as a society typically with our policies. Okay, so there are different ways in which we measure efficiency and different ways in which we measure equity, and equality may be one of them. But in terms of efficiency, certainly Pareto efficiency, the study of individual markets. Maybe you're studying the market for healthcare, the market for corn, or studying very specific markets and how those markets clear to arrive at equilibrium prices and quantities. That's sort of the area of efficiency and how efficiency might be measured by policy analysts. And then you have equality or equity. And one example of a measure that's often used here is called the Gini coefficient. And that just measures the degree of inequality in a given society on a scale of 0 to 1, with numbers closer to 1 being a more unequal society. And so it's thought that there's often a tension between the two. The more equal your society, then efficiency may go down and vice versa. And so these are primary concerns of policy analysts or economists for that matter. So I noted before that in economics, we're primarily concerned with the allocation of scarce goods and scarce resources, goods and services and such. And so on two ends of the extreme, right, and thinking about how to best allocate resources, if you're thinking about the extremes, you can leave those decisions about how to allocate resources up to the private individuals that may be involved in transactions. And where you do so, that's considered to be more of a capitalist structure on the one hand. And then where those decisions about how to allocate resources is governed by or dictated perhaps by some central authority or the government, then we call that more of a socialist or maybe even a communist or a centrally planned economy. And so the reality is that most social systems or most economies fall somewhere along that continuum. For me, I would argue that you really have to look at the particular sector or the particular market to see if it's more private or public in nature for that particular market itself. So healthcare, for example, right, is the amount of health expenditures in the healthcare industry, is it more done by private entities or public entities? So I would urge students to look a little more closely when thinking about these issues of capitalist structure, right, or a privatized system versus a more public system. In terms of fiscal policy, right, so fiscal policy, as I noted before, is referring to the government's taxing and spending authority. Okay, so taxing on the one side. So there are different ways, of course, in which governments generate revenue on the one side. And then, of course, there's the spending authority of the government, whether we're talking about the federal government or the state government. There are different ways, of course, in which governments spend their resources that they collect. And so where the amount of resources being collected by the government exceed the amount of spending that the government is engaged in, and once again, that's referring to either the federal, state, or local government for that matter, where the resources being collected exceed the amount of spending that the government is engaged in, we call that a surplus situation, right? A budget surplus, where the amount of revenues being generated is not tantamount to the amount of spending that the government is engaged in, then we call that a deficit situation. We're spending more, right? Just think about your credit card, or at least my credit card situations, right? If you might be spending more than you're actually taking in, then that's of course a deficit situation. And where those things approximate one another, the amount of revenue being generated on the one hand and the amount of spending being done, then that's a balanced budget. Once again, at whatever level of government you're thinking about. So this is just a note about the different ways in which we actually generate revenue and the ways in which governments spend that revenue that they generate. So taxes, certainly one way. Governments sometimes borrow where there's not enough revenue being generated through taxes. Sometimes government units at any level will borrow money in different ways. And then spending, of course, you can think about the different ways in which governments spend their resources. And most relevant for our purposes is in the way of social welfare services, of course. So let's just look on the revenue generating side for a second. And we said that one way in which government units generate revenue is through taxes. And so your book, your reading, notes three different types of taxes. You have progressive taxes, regressive taxes, and proportional taxes. So first, in the way of a progressive tax, when we refer to a progressive tax, this refers to where the level of income, right? It could be, so thinking in the way of federal tax, for example, right? If we're thinking in the way of federal taxes, you have individuals, right, that file taxes, you have married couples that file taxes, you have heads of household that file taxes. So at whatever level you're talking about, as the income levels increase, where the income levels increase, if the rate of tax also increases, we call that a progressive tax. So once again, whether we're thinking about individuals, couples, or heads of households, so as the income levels increase, where the rate of tax decreases, we call that a regressive tax. Right? So we have a declining slope in the case of regressive tax. We have an increasing slope in the way of a progressive tax. In the way of proportional tax, it's like it sounds, so it's proportional at all levels. So at any level of income where the rate of tax is going to stay flat, sometimes called a flat tax, therefore. And so we have the flat tax in the third scenario. So different examples here. So our progressive tax, this is certainly the case with our federal income tax structure. So higher income folks, individuals, married couples, heads of household, will pay a higher rate of tax, will be in a higher tax bracket, in other words, as their incomes rise. So we have 10% at the lowest level, all the way up to upwards close to 40% at the highest levels in the way of our federal tax. Now, regressive taxes are a little bit tricky. It's not so, at least when I was an undergrad, it wasn't so apparent to me at first. So in the way of a sales tax, a sales tax is one example of a regressive tax. And at first blush, it may seem like a proportional or flat tax. So the sales tax in Chicago today happens to be 9.25%, right? So let's just say about almost 10%, just for ease of calculation in the example that I'm about to give. But it seems like a flat tax. Everyone is paying the 10%. But imagine this scenario. So let's say I go to Nordstrom Rack. Right? I go to Nordstrom Rack and I purchase a shirt for $30. And so my tax is going to be almost $3 on that shirt. But Bill Gates, let's say, just for the sake of this example, that Bill Gates also goes to Nordstrom Rack and he purchases the same shirt, $30, and so he's also going to pay almost a $3 tax. But we both pay the same amount of tax, but assessed as a percent of our income. So $3 as a percent of my income is going to be a much larger share than $3 as a percent of Bill Gates' income. Excuse me. And so we're thinking about the impact that that tax is going to have on a lower income worker relative to a higher income worker, right? And so we call that regressive in nature. So another example, think about a gasoline tax, or just think about gas prices in general, right? When gas prices all of a sudden they shoot up, you can imagine the sort of impact that it has on, if we're assessing regressivity or progressivity, we're assessing the impact, relatively speaking, on lower income populations versus higher income populations. And so certainly a higher gas price is going to have a much greater impact on lower income populations relative to higher income populations. And that's another way that we characterize, that's another way that we're defining regressive taxes, right? And then finally, we have the idea of a proportional or a flat tax. And so once again, as income increases, right, the rate of tax stays the same. And the Medicare tax, historically, up until 2013 was an example. This is an example offered by Dolgoff in your textbook, but of course your textbook is outdated now. But it used to be a 1% tax regardless of the income level. But since the Affordable Care Act was implemented with respect to Medicare in 2013, we have a higher rate of tax, a 1%, almost a 0.99% tax increase on wealthy individuals. And so it's now a progressive tax. One example of a flat tax that we have here in Illinois is, of course, our state individual income tax rates, right? Our state tax rates are at 5% for this year, for 2014. It was set to go back down to 2013, but our General Assembly has kept it at 5% for next year, or for this year, I'm sorry. Just a quick note on monetary policy. This is another way in which our government controls our economy and more specifically about the money supply and the amount of spending that occurs, or saving and borrowing behavior. And so this is a hierarchical structure. You have the Federal Reserve Bank. At the top of that structure, you have 12 regional banks in the middle of that structure, and then of course you have the local banks. And the general idea here is that the federal government will control saving and borrowing behavior through what's called a discount rate, a setting of a discount rate. This is essentially an interest rate that gets passed down eventually at the level of the consumer. So you can imagine what the incentive might be if we're thinking in the way of mortgages, what the incentive might be, right, where the interest rates are pretty low. There's going to be a tendency for people to borrow, right, for the purpose of a house purchase, purchasing a home. But where the interest rates are higher, interest rates have been low for quite a while now. They've stayed low, but you can imagine what the incentive might be, what sort of behavior government is trying to incentivize. When we increase that interest rate, there's less of an incentive for people to go out and borrow money for purchasing houses, if we're talking about that specific type of interest rate. And so this is another action taken by our government to control people's economic behavior. And so I'm noting here just the sort of overall significance of fiscal and monetary policy. And these are measures taken by our government to stabilize, and sometimes in the case of more sort of recessionary periods, of course, these are measures taken to stabilize or stimulate our economy. And we talk about two different approaches, generally speaking. We talk about a Keynesian approach, or Keynesian economics is pronounced after a very famous economist, John Maynard Keynes from Oxford. So we call this Keynesian economics, where the emphasis is a little bit different than supply-side theory, right? Supply-side economics that was characteristic, many economists will argue, back in the 1980s during the Reagan administration. So taking a little bit of a closer look here. In the way of Keynesianism, or Keynesian philosophy, the basic idea behind Keynesian philosophy is that where the economy sort of lags, or where it stalls, or where we need to sort of stimulate the economy, the idea is that the best way to stimulate or to stabilize the economy is through more government intervention, greater government involvement in different forms. It could be through public works, greater public works, that is, greater public projects or government projects. We saw this in the historical section last week when FDR created the Works Progress Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps. Right, these were certainly Keynesian in nature, with massive government involvement in order to stimulate the economy and to address the issue of unemployment. Obama's federal stimulus bill, right, his $8 trillion stimulus package in 2009 might be considered Keynesian in nature. That's heavy and direct government involvement for the purpose of stimulating and stabilizing the economy. So this is in the tradition of Keynesian economics. And then on the other side of that continuum, you have supply-side theory, which the main tool that's used from a supply-side theorist approach is in the way of tax cuts, right? You're focusing not on consumer behavior. How do we put more money into the people's pockets? That's not the approach, not on the consumer side, but more on the way of the firm side. The idea is that we would cut taxes, and so all the different things that would, all the benefits that would accrue to the firms, to corporate entities in the way of lower taxes, and then of course trickle-down theory is one sort of branch of thinking in this school of thought, right? That with greater profit margins, right? With tax cuts, you have greater profit margins for companies, and with those greater profit margins, companies may invest in better technologies, more efficient technologies that make the prices on goods cheaper for consumers, and therefore consumers go out and they spend more on the purchase of their products, or maybe with the profit margins, with the greater profit margins, maybe companies even go out and hire more workers. So the idea is different, right? On the one hand, you have government involvement in the way of Keynesian economics, and then in the way of supply-side theory, it's the tax cuts that are being emphasized. Okay, and so that's the first part of this lecture. In the second part of this lecture, as you can see behind me, we're going to pick up with how taxes, all the different ways in which taxes affect low-income populations, and more specifically, we'll be focusing on the earned income tax credit.